A key part of the decarbonization strategy of the federal government and various provincial governments like British Columbia is electrification of the economy. Now, economic modelers that I've interviewed say that Canada will likely need 2 to 3 times as much electricity as it currently produces by 2050. Well, where are we going to get it and how are we going to get it to where it needs to go? And there's all sorts of questions about the national grid and regional grids and so on. And I'm going to talk to Dr. Madeleine McPherson, who's an assistant professor at the University of Victoria, about a study that she's leading on BC and Alberta power grid interties. So welcome to the interview, Madeleine.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of your study, please?
Sure. So what we're doing is looking at the 4 Western provinces, so BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, and looking at what increased transmission interconnection between those 4 provinces will mean as we move forward on decarbonization targets. So basically what we're doing is looking at net zero by 2050 as our end goal, and looking at different decarbonization pathways to get us there.
So a number of economists that I've talked to have made the point that the renewable potential in Alberta and Saskatchewan pairs really well with the storage capacity of the hydroelectric systems in BC and Alberta. I mean, it just seems to be a match made in heaven. What are you finding in your study?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, as we can interconnect these provinces, we can share not only power itself and balance load curves and balance the variability and uncertainty of wind and mostly wind in Alberta and Saskatchewan with the huge storage capacity that is just inherently behind the dams of the large hydro assets in BC and Manitoba. But in addition to that, we can also share planning reserves. So we don't, instead of having each province having to carry a certain amount of planning reserve to make sure that the system is robust and reliable as we move forward, we can share those resources across the different provinces. And that also comes with huge economic benefits for each of the provinces.
So if I understand this correctly, each province now has to have a reserve of power to make sure that it has it can enough for peak load at any given time. But if you spread it out across 4 provinces with this system, then the amount of extra reserve you need less. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and we also find less variability in prices, so less spikiness in terms of the load, the prices, and so there's a lot of the main one is really the balancing, but there's a lot of sort of secondary effects that come on through increased transmission, a better coordination of better utilization of the generating assets that we currently have is another big one that helps to drive costs down. So there's sort of a wide variety of benefits that come from greater interconnection, and it's really our study is really about putting numbers to those, trying to quantify exactly what those are, and really to try to make the argument, so where are these big assets? They cost a lot of money to build, obviously, and so where is it worth it, and to who, who is benefiting from increased transmission, and to what extent?
I have a question for you that I've been dying to ask someone who's leading a study like yours, and that is the role of markets in this. Because in Alberta, you have a market-based system, and then in BC and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you have crown corporations, so you don't have a market. You basically got a monopoly. What is the role of markets in integrating all of those 4 electricity systems on an east-west basis?
Right. Yeah. And that's definitely one of the challenges that has been flagged by a number of people moving forward. As you know, the work of Kristen, who I believe you chatted with before, there have been a few people, including her, who have gone into the sort of the different legal frameworks that one could establish, different regulatory frameworks that could be established to sort of mitigate this issue, and this is of course the crux of the issue, right? That the provinces operate and plan their own provincial power systems. And that, and there's a strong rationale for that. And there's also a lot of history that around that. And so how do we balance that with this broader perspective, and the sharing of resources, that really, I think that decarbonization and increased penetration of variable renewables is really demanding that we take that. There's a lot of benefit from having that larger perspective, but balancing that with with that sort of provincial jurisdiction over power systems is definitely a key part of the solution, and I think one that we need to spend some more time thinking about and convening conversations around.
Now, you mentioned in your modeling that you've identified, who benefits where, and where do they benefit? What are some of the observations that you can share with us?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's we haven't actually, so we're running two models in our study. The first model is we call a capacity expansion model. So that really gets at the question of what infrastructure do we build and where. But in order to run that kind of very high level model, we actually run that for all of Canada, because if you build a large hydro asset in Quebec, it actually, and then a transmission line into Alberta, it actually impacts the running of the whole country. So when it comes to those big assets, we actually want to have that national perspective. But what comes with that broad scope in our model is some compromising of the operational details, and that's just comes down to the computational, what we can manage from a computational perspective in any given model run. So we actually break the problem up into two separate parts. The first one saying, what big infrastructure do we build and where? And then as a secondary sort of sub problem, we dispatch the power system on an hourly or even sub-hourly basis, with a lot more of the constraints, generator constraints, for example, minimum uptimes or downtimes, environmental flow constraints on hydro assets, power system. Yeah, okay.
Right. So we probably got a little into the weeds for the average viewer there. So my take on this is that you're basically building out the system. You're deciding where generating assets might go, where transmission lines might go, and so on, and then running simulations to see which is the most efficient way to do it, and particularly with respect to decarbonization. Have I got that right?
Right.
Okay. And can you share, we're kind of running out of time. So maybe what I'll do, can you give us one big observation from the study that viewers can take away?
Yeah, we're headed towards a system where, with a huge amount of load growth potentially, where we really need to be drawing on as many of the resources as we can if we want to mitigate costs and get to net zero, and electrify a bunch of loads that were not previously electrified. So we really need to be using all of the resources that we have at hand, and transmission is a big part of that.
Yes, and I would add just that we're not even talking about that. I mean, you and I are talking about it, and I'm sure some of your colleagues in this field are talking about it. We're not doing such a great job of talking about it either at the province to province or even at the national level. And that would seem that we need to do that fairly quickly, because the window to act is closing.
Yeah, and net zero is a challenge.
Right, and the longer the runway, the better. Madeleine, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much. Take care.